Welcome, Hari. I'm
Thank
so,
you.
so, so glad to be in conversation with you. Um,
Mutual.
and in all of these ways that we have been in conversation, I met you several years ago through our dear friend, Cynthia Dewi Oka, who is a facilitator for us and is coming back soon and contributed, of course, to We Were Not Alone.
Yep.
And I really feel like our relationship, though it was love at first sight, like friend love, right at the beginning, we started goofing off and doing some miming.
That's right.
Our creative and activism connection has grown during this time that we've been home, which is a really beautiful gift of these years and of these virtual workshops. So super grateful for the ways that you've expanded my understanding of community through your, just knowing you as a person, and then also our actual community, a community building artwork. So super grateful to have you here.
It's it's one of those things, right? The gifts you don't see coming, even though your homies and you're doing your thing, but then to start showing up to the workshops and just being there week after week. You almost feel guilty. I almost feel guilty sometimes for what a gift it's been.
Yes, absolutely. Exactly what you're talking about. And I think what's, struck me so much about the way that you move through the world in the past, years that I've been able to witness it close and far, is your collaborative spirit and the patience that collaboration takes and your capacity for that patience, because I think it's somewhere where I personally struggle, and those are the things that you notice in other people. You're like, holy crap. And it really showed up in this work you did at the helm of the anthology. Sent you an email last week saying people keep thanking me for the anthology. I feel like they're thanking me for your work, because it really was you. I didn't see the anthology until you put it together, right? You and the readers did this work. And I sort of briefly witnessed some of the emails flying by and some of the meeting titles as you were meeting and planning how folks should respond to other people's work and how to frame those conversations. Because, I always say at the heart of community is communication, and collaboration to go successfully requires really clear boundaries and also really respectful communication. And then, of course, we're working with the work of people's hearts, right?
Yeah.
Their poems.
Yeah.
And so it's sacred work. Can you talk a little bit about how you and that extraordinary group of readers went about that task for the anthology?
Yeah, it was I'm just gonna begin by naming the readers. Amelia Bain, Shuli Sochil Kaywood, Priti Kaur Dhaliwal, Dartinia Hull, Arthur Kazakian, Deanna Osborne, Martha Peterson, Eric Schwab, Ben Weekly, Kendra Whitfield, and Maiden Wood were amazing. I would assign people poems to read or pieces to read, and minutes or hours later, at least one person was on it. So I think that part of it. Sorry?
I'm going to interrupt briefly and say that
Yeah.
that list of people includes veterans from multiple eras. It includes healthcare workers. It includes CBAW board members, civilian poets, published and emerging writers. So really diverse range of people.
Yeah, such an amazing crew of folks. And I think that really that's a lot of the folks who could make it from the group of us who were meeting every Friday morning. That's who that is. And then of course we've got the design from Garrett, which is hours and hours and hours of patience on his part. I think when I heard your question, the stuff that jumped right out at me, in terms of intentionality was first we gather, and we needed to know what our goals were, and we needed to know how we were going to support each other to make them happen, and the first thing that made it easy, apart from like the amazingness of the folks themselves, was that we were looking to try and include one piece of work from everybody who sent something in. So our like choice was like just moving towards our joy, you know? We weren't trying to like tell this person or this person or this person that they weren't going to be in the anthology. We were just choosing what we wanted to welcome most and what we wanted to share most, you know? And so like beginning from that place, I think really helped us like in our reading process be like, this is the one that I want most for most people to read, you know?
Yeah.
And I mean, we made our guidelines, you know, in community. I had some that I wanted to make sure that we had in terms of like, how do we approach reading other people's work? How do you make sure that you're not going to run into your own work and like read other people's comments on it, even as we welcome folks to like, you know, speak generously towards each other's work, you know? We're so sensitive writers. And so like,
Yeah.
you know, someone being like, I love this one more than this one might be like, but I love that poem so much. Why do you hate me? You know? So,
That's exactly.
right? Like that's what we're like as human beings and as writers. And so like we wanted to welcome folks to move as much with their joy as possible and as much with like what moves you the most, what troubles you the most, what makes you like, what really makes you want to share it the most and be like, this, look at this over here, this, I want you to read this so bad, you know? And I think that's where we met. And, you know, there were ones where folks would send in 3 amazing pieces. And the like the most difficult moments were when multiple people loved multiple pieces in a packet of 3, you know,
Yeah.
and I might have a favorite and Arthur might have a different favorite. And we had to figure out like, again, back to like, what's the one we want to share most with the world? What's the one that we needed most and therefore we think that other people might need most? You know, what does the most to us, for us? And you know, one of the things that you talk about in workshop, and actually that's one of the things we did was the guidelines for when we go to sit down and write. You know, we started with those guidelines for what we're going to read. You know, we're like, let's share the stuff that feels the most true. Let's share the stuff that feels the most needed over, you know, like what might be the prettier poem, for example, you know? And so we started with those things in mind. And by starting with those things in mind, yeah, I really think we got to the heart of a lot of poems with a lot of heart. And
Yeah.
that's what we have like in the readings, like, you know, like one piece after another, like hits. And the people who are receiving them are like, wow, you know, I've had people respond like, they're like, I don't know if I could have handled 3 more readers. And not because it was like long, but because it was like so much emotional truth, you know, in a short time. And I think that that's what we made, you know.
Yeah, and I've been seeing that in the readings as we've had 2 so far, and it's like there is not a dull moment. There's not a moment, and you know we have this combination of some people it's their very first time being published this anthology, and we moved from a place it sounds like of inclusivity, right? Like how do we include everyone? Which so much of the industrial art complex is about creating exclusivity, creating this like narrow lane. And we have this range of really established kind of international voices in poetics alongside people who are being published for the first time. And one of the things that I've heard from people, from these facilitators, from these, you know, writers whose work we've been enjoying and admiring for so long, at the end of the readings, I'll get a note or a text message that's like, oh, that's what poetry is for. This, thank you for this night. This is a reminder of what poetry is supposed to be about. And it is about communication. It is about conversation. And you've arranged the anthology in such a way that you know, like, of course, the title is We Were Not Alone, but even our poems are not alone, right? In this anthology, it's like they have this company, they're sandwiched between each other, they're responding to one another. And I've never seen a book like this before, where one poem inspires the next, and you can see this sort of narrative thread between unrelated authors. Can you talk about like how you made that happen? Or, I mean, it's interesting to be creating art using other people's art, because the anthology is a piece of art that you created using these individual pieces from a group of other artists.
I think it, you know, for me anyway, it really goes back to making actual mixes and actual mixtapes and wanting to put, you know, two songs that might not be about the same thing beside each other because of how the beats remind each other of each other, how like there might be one melody that carries through from one song to the next. And so I've always thought of arrangement a little bit like that. And then when I'm sitting and looking at the manuscript, and it was especially when we started to receive the inspiration poems, because so many of these poems are written directly after, like, you or another facilitator will share a poem in a workshop, and then folks will sit down and write, you know, and some might explicitly use language from the previous poem, and some might just have these like melodic echoes that you wouldn't otherwise.
Vibration of the poem.
Exactly. At the vibrational level, the poems are related. They were forged in a relationship with each other. And so when I started to see those pieces show up, and we requested folks to be like, please, you know, as much as you can remember, and sometimes we would like, folks wouldn't remember, and we would like go digging through the archives, you know, especially you would go digging through the archives to be like, what was the connection? What did I share that day? Was it like March, or was that like late January? And then you go back and you'd find, you know, like what are the relationships? And it just really felt like that was the most natural through line, you know? And so there is some, you know, and again, because of that, some of it is arranged temporally, like in time, like there's a loose, and it's not total, right? But there's a loose, you know, like almost archive of 1 year of pandemic that flows a little bit like that, but it is more like I'd say that the like relationships within the poems is more primary, you know? And so you've got the inspiration poems, you got the poems that have like relationships with them. And every so often you'll have like one poem that sets off 3 or 4 that are in the, you know, that are in the final book. And I love those moments. And I find that I found that like you would find relationships between poems also that were not necessarily directly, you know, because it'd be like one poem and one poem together, or like one poem and 3 poems together. And then how do you arrange them overall? And then those kinds of like themes started to emerge. And I find that when you're working with other people's work, one of the things that I love most, and I learned this from Ching Chen when she did this really cool thing called the Collaborative Manifesto Remix Project, like a bunch of years ago. And what I learned about my own writing in that process was that like you can take stuff that isn't yours, right? If you like just take a bunch of stuff and follow like what calls you the most, if you're really listening to what calls you the most, your obsessions will emerge. Right. And so what comes up afterwards will be like as accurate a representation of your own obsessions as if you had sat down to write yourself. And sometimes even more so, because when we sit down to write ourselves, we'll often like look away from the things we want to look at most, right, you know, because we're scared to write them. But when you see them, then you pull them towards you, you know. And I think that that's what happened with this, is that like the poems saw each other and called themselves towards each other, or called each other towards themselves. And that's how the arrangement kind of happened.
And I think like, I mean, it's so beautiful to pay attention to your obsessions as a reader, as a writer. It's, you know, that it's our obsessions maybe the thing that makes us who we are.
Yeah,
Um,
I think so.
and I think it's also what you said about the temporal sort of arc. We were all, though we were in all of these different places, we were never in the same room,
Yeah,
literally.
yeah,
We were experiencing the world together in such, and it's the globalization of news. You know, there are all of these, this confluence of all of these things that's made it that way, particularly, but even generally, like there was never a time that any art was created without the context of the era in which it was created, right? There
yeah.
is, I think it's Rebecca Solnit who said there's nobody who is ahead of their time, or was it Adrienne Rich? Because
I
if you
don't
wrote
know.
it, you're in your time, right? You're not
Right.
ahead of your time, you're right in your time. And
Yeah.
that I think is such an interesting thing about all of these poems, is that even it, you know, like there's this sort of like, we were in the same trauma. Sometimes
Yeah.
there were wildfires, sometimes there were earthquakes, you know, and each week there was something for us to come and sit around the table. And whether we grappled with it directly or not, many of the same themes emerge in that collective space.
You're reminding me of um, there's a podcast called Heat Rocks that I love, and they had a DJ on, and they asked these three questions. It was like, was it ahead of its time? You know, was it of its time? Or was it like behind the times? You know, and the response was, it was right on time. And I feel like that's the like when you know, whether it was whichever of those poets that you named said it, you know, like that is the thing. Like all of these poems, when they happened right on time, you know, and they were made like you said, we were never in the same room together, but we were like always in the same time together.
Mm.
And you know, and again, regardless of time zone, we were in the same moment together, you know, and regardless of place, we were in the same time together. There's a hummingbird flying in front of me. You know, and like whether it was moments of violence, police violence, whether it was moments of like when um, pandemic restrictions hit, you know, differently in different places. Um, and then there were so many people with individual griefs, you know, as well as the collective griefs, that like we're able to and are able to continue to like support each other in those moments. You know, when people are willing to look at what's coming up for them the most, then other people are able to witness and able to like connect to what they need to connect to the most. And I think that that runs, again, it runs like all the way through this anthology, but it does that because it runs all the way through the work that CBAW does, you know, and the artists that are invited, and the questions that you ask, you know, the questions that we ask. Like you said, if there's like, our obsessions lead to our questions, and then the ones that we're like willing to grapple with the most are the ones that we're going to put on the page, you know. And sometimes they're hiding and like they find their way through anyway, you know. And that shared space allows us to like return to them and like return ourselves to ourselves that way, even as we're sharing time, you know, those like writing moments, we're really like able to return to ourselves in ways that so many other practices and conditions of our world prevent us from doing.
Yeah. And you know, on the topic of griefs, right, as our community has been meeting for all of these years now, but you know, week after week after week, and people are going through these kinds of losses, grappling with personal illness or the loss of parents. I'm reminded again and again of how, when my father died, one of the things my mother and I would marvel at once in a while was the size of our grief and the fact that it's not extraordinary, right? That this is something that everyone goes through and everyone feels it this big. And at the same time, we feel like, how could anybody survive this size of grief?
Yeah.
And the heart of like I think the thing that's very useful about a community in which people are grappling with their griefs aloud is that you learn how to grieve. You learn from somebody in a different season than you. And so many of the spaces that we're in are like limited. You know, we're always talking about which generation are you, Gen X, are you millennial, are you whatever. We're always talking about these ways that we are within a sliver of a group. But being in a place where people are at different ages and at different stages of whatever it may be, I've learned so much about how to grieve, which is really the other side of how to love.
Yeah.
Right.
That's right. That's right. You can't have grief without love.
No.
You wouldn't need it.
You wouldn't need it.
You know? And so, yeah. And so, like you say, the flip side of that is that if you have love, you must always have the potential for grief, you know? And if you have grief, then there's also the potential for love.
Yes, capacity is
there, right? Because it wouldn't be possible without. So that's I mean, and again, when we talk about, we mentioned early like how lucky we are and how like sometimes we feel a bit of guilt about that. Like that's the other piece, is there's like in the process we've always had joy, you know. And like someone will share a piece that makes us laugh, you know. We specifically have comedy workshops, and you know, comedians can be some of the best poets at dealing with grief, you know. And also like sharing space in a room almost always has a potential for joy, you know, because that's like, I always think of joy as a collective thing. Like when I feel joy, it always has to do with something larger than myself, I think. Whether it's like relationships with other beings, not necessarily human beings, etc., you know. And so I think that like, again, cultivating a place where you can approach, whether it's grief, whether it is the events of the day, whether it is like the super mundane, you know, I think that makes space for joy.
Yeah. Which brings me directly to this phrase, towards wonder, which is the title of the workshop you'll be leading for us in April. And which I think the phrase really encapsulates your work and what we strive for as a community, right? And to take the truth and turn our faces towards wonder the way that plants turn towards the sun, right? This is what we need. Wonder to renew our daily experiences, to see anew. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit, you could talk a little bit about what wonder means to you, and how you sharpen that, sort of that sensitivity, that sense.
I mean, I can't begin the conversation without naming, you know, like a personal and collective grief around here. You know, we lost a dear, like essentially my de facto brother-in-law, lover to Nikki, father to Kaya, like homie to like this whole community of folks. Co-founded a DJ school called Table Tutors, DJ Wondercut, Eric Cardeno. And he, in his passing, brought so many folks together and reminded us of his approach toward DJing and making music. And as a teacher and as a father, was always one of wonder. And there's a story that's not mine to tell, but a repeated relational moment between himself and Kaya that is very specifically about his wonderment at her and like and her curiosity, you know. And I think that this also like dovetails with, one of my original wounds is doubt, and I generally move through the world with like a devastating amount of self-doubt at all times. And the thing that's older than doubt, and this came up in a poem I was writing, and it came up in like meditation and things I've been listening to, and it comes up in the workshops, is that curiosity is older than doubt, and wonderment is like, because wonder is about something larger than yourself, I believe, and because wonderment is like about allowing yourself to be affected in this way. I think that it there's few things that can undercut doubt more than wonder can, and I think it cuts through so many things. And I mean, again, I go back to our conversation about the anthology and how do we select, and I could rephrase some of the things we said with choose the poem that gives you the most wonder. I could and I mean, make the decision that gives you the most wonder, and move towards the approach when it comes to writing that gives me the most wonder. And so whether it's grief, loss, joy, whether it's the mundane, if you can find wonderment in that, I think that's where the magic lies. And so that's when I go to sit, if I want to invite people to write, and I really I didn't understand the reason one of the other reasons I brought Eric up is I didn't understand how crucial that was to me until it was lensed through him, and through his wonderment, and the wonderment that he engendered in us, even at the height of our panic when we were searching for him. And the wonderment he engendered us for each other as we witnessed each other being the most beautiful versions of ourselves in holding each other in our grief. I think that that's another thing when you talk about when we talk about grief, unfortunately, but also fortunately, sometimes we see the most amazing parts of each other when we have to hold someone else in their grief. We become really full in our humanity, and I think that if we can invite that to the writing process, to a fullness of our humanity, I think that wonderment is a way to do that. So I hope that that's something that I can do in a workshop, and I hope that that's something that I can do when I go to sit down on the page later today.
Yeah, it's so beautiful. And as you were talking about it, I was just thinking about how the relationship between wonder and uncertainty, wonder and doubt, I mean, they're the same thing, just a decision to be delighted by it versus a decision to be uncomfortable because you think you're supposed to know.
Right. Or to move into that discomfort, to be what is here?
Yeah.
Wonderment allows the curiosity to ask questions, and I think that you said that about when I'm not looking for answers and when I'm not looking for certainty, for lack of a better phrase, the truest things come.
Yes. Yeah. So beautiful. Well, I think we're all so fortunate to have you distilling the lessons, the hard and beautiful lessons of living on the page, and then sharing your wisdom in workshops. So grateful for you and for all of the ways that you build and spread community and wonder. Thank you.
Mutual. Thank you, Seema.